In a wide, diverse format like Battlecruiser EDH, flexible cards, especially cards which have multiple abilities, such as modal spells and permanents with modal effects, are the cards I've found to be the most useful because they increase your odds of having a relevant play during any part of the game. These usually cost more mana, but in Battlecruiser EDH we usually have the extra mana needed. This is different than a format like CEDH, where the narrow card pool means the focus is on efficient cards which tend to have a more specialized use case. What do I mean by modal card? According to the rules definition, a modal card is any card with multiple modes. The most common of these currently are probably the modal double-faced land cards. So, for example, Disciple of Freyalise, which can be played as a land or as a creature which can draw you cards. These MFDC land cards are ideal since they can be played as a land when you need to make a land drop, or if you top deck this in the late game, then rather than be mana flooded, you can cast the front side to draw into more cards. Also, you can do other tricky plays. For example, if you run a bounce land, you can use the bounce land to return the land to your hand, then cast the front side. Or you can cast the front side, and if you run something like Crucible of Worlds, which allows you to play lands from the graveyard, you can play the land side for additional card advantage. Now, back when I first started playing EDH, the most popular modal spells were the commands, Austere Command and Cryptic Command being the most prominent. These cards, as well as cards such as Charms, can also be very powerful spells because they almost always have a relevant mode regardless of the state of the game. For example, with Counterspell, all it can do is counter a spell. If the game state is such that countering a spell isn't useful, then this is a dead card in your hand. For example, Counterspell isn't actually useful if my opponent has already developed their board state, and it might be of only marginal value if my opponent is running a tribal deck with Cavern of Souls out. Whereas with Cryptic Command, I can potentially tap down my opponent's creatures before they swing at me, or bounce a creature which is already swinging at me. Plus, it can draw a card and replace itself, so I don't lose card advantage relative to my other opponents. Now, of course, we could point out that Cryptic Command has a much higher mana cost than Counterspell, but again, in Battlecruiser EDH, we often have enough mana to pay for the additional costs that come with modal spells, and the bigger issue is having spells that are actually relevant to the current state of the game. There are also modal spells in the form of creatures, such as Silverback Elder. Not only is he a big creature, but he has this modal triggered ability which almost always has a relevant mode. He offers repeatable artifact or enchantment removal, as well as repeatable ramp and life gain. All three of these can be relevant at almost any point of a casual EDH game. The 2 and 3 mana charms can also be really solid modal cards. Boros Charm is played normally to protect your own stuff, but occasionally you can give a big creature double strike to finish the game, or just lightning bolt someone to the face for 4. I've even had games where someone was swinging lethal damage at me, and I used Boros Charm to kill them and save myself. Even Izzet Charm is a card I like to play. If someone taps out for Cyclonic Rift or Teferi's Protection, I can counterspell it. Or if nothing in my hand is relevant, I can use it to dig for better cards. Even the 2 damage effect has its place, as there are plenty of low toughness creatures worth hitting. Speaking of charms, I even once ran Misery Charm in a Cleric's tribal deck, and I was surprised at how useful it was. Not only was it great to have the option to return an important cleric from the graveyard to my hand, but a surprising number of good creatures in the game are clerics, and so there are many times I actually use the first mode to take out someone's Tymna or their Mother of Runes. There are also cards which aren't technically modal according to the rules definition, but still do multiple things. For example, if someone were to ask me what the best card in my Giada Angel Waifu deck was, I probably wouldn't say Avacyn or Sarah's Emissary. I'd probably say Angel of the Runes, because it's a large, on-theme creature, it exiles 2 artifacts or enchantment when it enters, and it also has an occasionally useful cycling ability. Let's imagine I have a starting hand with Ancient Tomb and no other lands. If I have Angel of the Runes in my opening hand as well, it can turn an unkeepable hand into a totally usable one, since I can turn 1, play Ancient Tomb, and then cycle Angel of the Runes to get a Plains to get the white mana I need to cast additional spells. Even later in the game, there might be a situation where I have Graveyard Recursion, for example Amaria's Shepherd, and I cycle Angel of the Runes into my graveyard and get a Plains, and then play that Plains to return Angel of the Runes into play for free. Even if I have to pay 7 mana to cast Angel of the Runes, it's still better than an equivalent removal card like Return to Dust, because I get to both advance my own board state while also exiling threatening artifacts and enchantments my opponents have. In EDH, it's better if you don't find yourself in situations where you have to choose between building your own board state or dealing with your opponents. You really always want to try to be doing both in multiplayer, because if you spend your turn slowing one player down without advancing your own game state, your other 2 opponents are going to advance relative to you. In general, cards with cycling are useful in EDH. Back before there were so many useful lands, the cycling lands were run in most decks that otherwise couldn't get enough draw. But even today, the Triome cycling ability can be very relevant, and I also like these two-colored cycling lands. I can't tell you how many times I've cycled one of these lands to then go on to draw a card, which secured me the win. I actually really like any land card that can do multiple things. For example, Corehaven is one of my favorite lands because it enters untapped and has a solid maze effect. Since I mostly run 1 and 2 colored decks, it's easy for me to run a colorless land card like Corehaven with no downside, and since people don't usually run a lot of ways to interact with lands, it can be a very durable, repeatable fog effect. Plus, since it's colorless, even if someone has swords equipped to their Voltron commander, you can still target said commander, and since it's a land, you can still use it on an opponent's turn, even if they have something which limits instant speed interaction. To make this video a little bit spicy, I'll touch on a very controversial subject and say that cycling abilities are actually one of the reasons I don't hate Commander Sphere as much as a lot of people do. Now, I will say I only very rarely run this card these days, given a 3 mana rock that taps for 1 just isn't as good with all the other options that are now available, but I still don't consider this card inherently unplayable, especially in a deck where I might recur it. For example, if I have Sun Titan in a mono white deck, then it's fun and somewhat effective to recur the Commander Sphere to get an extra card and mana each turn. Plus, in playgroups where artifact destruction is rampant, it can be nice to be able to sacrifice my mana rock so I don't end up going down 1 card. Cards which technically only have 1 ability, but are broad in their scope, are also very useful. For example, Beast Within and Generous Gift hit any permanent, which means they're almost always relevant cards. Plus, there are a few narrow circumstances where you actually want to Beast Within your own permanent to generate a blocker for yourself. I can count on one hand the number of times I've wanted to make that play, but when I did, it actually felt good to keep myself alive by generating a blocker at instant speed. Now, some people might say that none of these cards are particularly good or busted. However, these kinds of cards are more about giving you options and providing glue to keep the more busted parts of your deck together. For example, even in my Kozilek the Great Distortion deck, which is built almost entirely around casting Kozilek in the first 4 turns of the game so that I can then discard my mana rocks to counterspell people's ramp, I still like to run Blasted Landscape and Mindstone, because even the most powerful casual decks sometimes need a little push to keep them moving forward. In other words, there are games where you're 1 card away from getting back into the game, and there are games where you're 1 mana away from getting back into the game. Having a card that can be either that extra mana or that extra card will help ensure your deck always keeps moving forward. In Battlecruiser EDH, that flexibility often trumps raw efficiency because the format rewards the ability to pivot as the game evolves. Cards with modal or dynamic effects offer that flexibility, acting as the sort of Swiss Army knife of your deck. They may not win the game on their own, but they can help ensure you always have a fighting chance.